Going to go ahead and welcome up our next panel to continue this discussion on maximizing returns, and we've been building our Keiretsu exit advisory panel here over the last 6 months or so. And as of today, we've published our exit handbook. So if anybody would like to pick that up, we have some copies outside. And it goes into a lot of the ins and outs of how to sell your company. A lot of content contributed by Basil and the rest of our exit advisors here. So please do take a look at that. And we're excited to have that launch as a new resource for our portfolio companies. And very pleased to turn things over to Richard Samuelson here to give us a little update overview and some panel introductions, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions. So, Richard?
Okay, thank you, Nathan. We have here some very distinguished exit advisors with distinguished careers in that subject. Bernie Rudnick is the managing partner for Capgenic Advisors. Mary Jo Potter is the managing director for Healthcare Angels, and of course you've just heard from Basil Peters, who runs Strategic Exits. So I'm going to let them each introduce themselves, at least briefly, with a germane background, and then I'll end up. Why don't we start with Bernie?
Okay. Microphone on?
Yep.
I'm deaf, so I have to ask. In any event, I've been an entrepreneur and investor for more years than I care to talk about. I have about $7.5 billion in strategic exits. I've done 8 startups. I've exited 3 of those, returned about $800 million to investors, and dividended another $130 million 3 years ago. And I'm a advisor to Fund 2 and Fund 3, Keiretsu Capital Fund 2 and Fund 3, as well as being a limited partner in 3 additional venture funds.
Mary Jo Potter. I'm involved either as a GP or an LP in 4 different funds. Been involved in some way in this angel investing world for about 18 years. My first investment was Supercuts, which is an interesting story. Been involved in about 20 M&A transactions, so we'll talk a bit about some of those. And I guess the most important thing about the exit discussion is I think we're going to see, although the good news is Barry says there's lots of money chasing it, there's also a lot of obstacles. I focus on healthcare, so I may have a slightly different bent on what's going on the exit side, but we'll talk about some of the obstacles.
I think a lot of you have heard my background, but I started a company in grad school. It's now part of Cisco. Sold that about 30 years ago, been an angel investor ever since, done over 100 angel investments. About 20 years ago, I realized that it was, for me at least, easy to fall in love and write a check, but the real trick was getting the money back. And for the last 20 years, I've been obsessively focused on just one thing, which is how to remonetize those investments in early stage companies. Today I have a small boutique investment bank, just a handful of people, and we are having more fun than we should be allowed to have right now with this wonderful M&A market.
Richard Samuelson. I'm a newcomer here. I've only been angel investing for about 8 years. Initially joined Keiretsu then. I was a career investment banker, all equity and equity derivatives. Left that business in 2008 with a whole generation of investment bankers. I'm invested in 25 companies. I've had 3 exits, 3 bankruptcies. And the others are mostly doing well. So I guess I fit into the normal Keiretsu or angel investing pattern. I'd like to begin with Mary Jo. And the first question is, how do you spot a problem investment, and what can be done about that in terms of exiting? And you're all welcome to address the question, but why don't we start with Mary Jo?
Well, of course, it helps. You usually don't see it right up front. You know, after you do all the due diligence, all you see is sort of the good news. Usually a year to 2 years in, a couple things happen. Often there's a change of leadership, and that can be good, but it's also problematic. The other thing is, usually you start seeing the problems as you need further funding. So they start creeping in then. The third issue often is, as you ask people about exits, there's wonderful theoretical discussion about them, but if you actually ask them, do they know people in those companies? Do they have any relationship with them? Have they ever been involved with them? The ones that I tend to think of are going to do well often have all of these things in place. The leadership doesn't change as much. Their rounds of funding seem to go a little easier, and almost always they have relationships with potential strategics that at least give you a sense that an exit is possible. So as we look at things, you tend to see the problems in about year 2 and 3.
Thank you. Bernie, any comment on that?
Yeah, well, what do you do when those elements don't come together in that fashion? And, you know, people think of exits as a way to get significant returns. I look at exits 2 ways. I've gotten significant returns on exits, but I look at exits as a way to preserve some of the capital in a business. I've been invested in a number of businesses that ended up in mergers that were not completely satisfied. We didn't get all of our money back, but to the extent we got 80% back, we were tickled because the alternative would have been failure. So if you think about exits in that way, a way to save a company, a way to grow and return to investors, you look at life a little differently.
Thank you. Basil, any further comment?
Maybe just to quickly add, you've got to watch these companies to know if they're progressing as you would hope. And in the companies that are more mature and have financials, that's easy. But what we're seeing today is, a good fraction of companies that are sold before they have any revenue. So the financials at that point really don't tell you very much. So I think you've got to pay closer attention than ever before. And to Bernie's point, I'm talking to people who have portfolios all the time, and I'm surprised by how often today in this market people are saying, yeah, I'm cleaning up my portfolio, I'm selling my losers. Because in this market, you can't.
One other comment, 2 examples. The first company that I built and sold was to McGraw-Hill. That was the good news. The bad news was we had been approached a year before that, thought we had a deal. For a variety of reasons, it was not a good deal, so we did back out of it. But when you go through that, then I saw it as a board member on Ocular Sciences. By the time we sold to the Coopers, again, that was the good news. A few years before that, they too had been approached. The company that approached them in the middle of our transaction got purchased themselves, so had to back out. And in both cases, when you think you're ready to sell and all the employees and the investors are thinking, all right, and then you have to announce, never mind, trying to restart those companies, very difficult, very difficult.
Let me pose a slightly different question. So what are the key elements of an exit plan, a successful one, and when does the planning begin? Maybe Basil, we can start with you.
I've been saying for many years that I wish entrepreneurs understood that the exit strategy is a prerequisite to the financing strategy. So what I wish happened, and I admit this does not happen very often, is that the company had a clear vision as to where they were going before they started to talk to investors. 2 reasons. One of them is that's what every investor is wanting to know. How do I get my money back? The other reason is that different types of investors are compatible with different exit strategies. So unless you know where you're going, I don't see how you can take even the first step towards getting there.
Do you have any comment?
Another problem we have, I bet half the people that come to us for money, I encourage them not to take money. Because as you talk about it and you say, oh, and let's talk about the exit strategy, they'll talk about it, but then you ask them, now in your heart, are you really ready to give up this company within 4 or 5 years? Well, no, actually I'm hoping it's 10. So the problem is people want the money for security, but they may not necessarily really want to sell it. And so helping people think that through, there's a lot of nice $10 million lifestyle companies. Why confuse your life, take money, and then spend so much of it trying to exit it for the shareholders? So again, this issue, unfortunately, because it sounds good to get all this money up front, but in the end, I've been on a number of boards where it's painful. The CEOs really don't want to sell.
Especially when they've tasted some success.
Yeah.
And they're getting substantial salaries. They built what they recognize as a sustainable business, well, that's not an investable business unless it exits the public market, in which case, okay, it should be a sustainable business. But we have liquidity.
Bernie, have you seen a difference in strategy toward exiting across different sectors? I know you're strongly involved in biotech, but you've had other types of investment. Is there a different strategy that you approach software with versus biotech versus something else, or is it pretty much the same?
Well, fortunately, I've exited companies in every one of those sectors, but being as heavily involved in life science is different. Sometimes the market and the market dynamics drive the exit potential. For example, when many companies 5 years ago, major pharmaceutical companies hit the patent cliff, about $8 billion worth of captive revenue went away because drugs became generic. Well, the reaction was a gut-wrench reaction. They started laying off large portions of their scientific teams. Well, that's good for startups. It makes more great scientists available. But for all intents and purposes, these companies had no way to get innovation into their companies except acquiring young companies. And a phenomenon that had never occurred through all time started occurring 4 or 5 years ago when companies, the number one in cancer, in oncology, in the year 2015, more companies were acquired in the discovery stage. And let me put that in context for those of you who don't understand that. There's discovery, preclinical, when you're testing in animals, clinical, when you're testing in people, and then registrations, various clinical trials. So for all intents and purposes, the beginning of a company is discovery, where you've got benchtop proof on your science. 56% of the exits were discovery. It was mind-boggling. So now, where people thought about biotech as being a 12 or 14, or maybe before I die, I'll see an exit, it changed. Now exits typically in biotech and pharmaceuticals happen in 4 to 7 years.
Any comment, Joe?
Well, because I'm in healthcare as well, the medtech side of it is also very interesting because unlike, and I've been involved in just technology acquisitions where there's lots and lots of choices of companies. In the medtech side, one of the limiters, quite frankly, is the number of buyers. And while other industries are now creeping into healthcare, which I think is great because it expands that population, in a meeting of 8 companies in the day, 6 of them will be talking about the same acquirers. And I'll say, how many companies do you think XYZ company can acquire? So that's one problem. The second problem you've got in the medtech space anyway is adoption. There's lots of money, there's lots of great ideas. Trying to get some of these great ideas into the system, especially on the provider-payer side, very difficult. They're so distracted with their EHRs and population management and mergers. So in the healthcare space, it's a bit challenging right now because, again, it is not short of product and money.
Oswald, any comment?
I agree.
Then let me start with another question for you. Usually acquisition is the normal exit pattern. An IPO is also possible. Have you seen other approaches to exiting that ensure that shareholders get their money back either early on, maybe at a lower rate, or later on at the point of IPO or acquisition? Give us some scenarios there.
You know, it's a great question, and often when we're speaking to a board, they will have questions about other ways to monetize a company. The typical one you hear is, well, we're going to license the technology. The comment that I have is that if you go out and research what actually happens, today I think probably 98% of successful recovery of angel investment is through a private company M&A transaction. We don't know for sure, we don't have really good data. 2% is through IPOs. The number of companies that have paid back investors through cash flow or licensing or other alternatives is so small that, in my opinion, it's kind of like a lottery ticket. And it's certainly not a good strategy. So I think it's always best to take the easy money. Today in this market, it's M&A. It's the highest value, easiest return. Other ones, whenever I see somebody suggesting, oh, we're going to license, we're going to cash flow, I ask them to find me some examples but nobody ever does.
Well, I can give an example.
As to
30-some years ago, when I happened to hire a sharp MBA for our firm, and knew this friend, and he said, you know, he's starting this company. It's for haircuts for, you know, college students and so on. I said, oh, sounds interesting. And he needed, I don't know, $10,000, something. So I said, sure, you know, he's a friend of yours, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I didn't know a thing about angel investing, but the proposition was, we will pay you X% of the profit indefinitely up through and including 2008. Well, this was, again, you're talking 28 years, whatever it was. And sure enough, all but 2 years of that, we got very nice cash flow. And eventually, obviously, they got purchased and so on, and I wasn't part of the purchase because I wasn't an equity holder. I was being paid based on the profits. But I don't think that's the craziest thing. I think we're going to see new forms. Once we get through this bubble, and again, of course, take whatever money is available at the cheapest you can. But I think there's other forms that bond people to you, engage you. We got more students. We did all sorts of things to get people into the Supercut stores. We were involved. It was fun. So I do think we should and could look at alternatives.
And Basil, here's another example, and Richard was a recipient of this example, as well as all the Keiretsu investors that came in. A number of years ago, helped a company called Immunomic Therapeutics. I became the CFO. I will very often take an active role, a board role, or an active role for some limited period of time within a company, so that, in fact, I can tell them where the potholes are, because I've hit most of them over the years, using that statement. Essentially, it was 2008, 2009. That was what I described as a nuclear winter of biotechnology and investing in general. No one was raising money during that time. And I thought, you know, we're in discussion with a couple of pharmaceutical companies. It looks like something may materialize. Why don't we create a dividend program? And as it turned out, we ended up dividending $130 million back to investors who invested 12.1. They still own all their stock. The company is likely to exit the public market in the next 2 years, and they'll get a 30 to 40 times return on equity as a result of the dividend. But they got, on average, 4.2 to 7.2 times their money back, depending on when they invested in that round, because it was designed that way. It was in the PPM. It was a company designed to, in a time when it was very difficult to gather investment, build confidence that here's a mechanism where you're going to see your money fairly soon. Here's the proof that that may happen. Let's go forward. And people invested.
Another question. In respect of exiting, strictly speaking, how much of it is an issue that the entrepreneur is a first-time entrepreneur versus someone who's been down through this rodeo before? And I want to start with Mary Jo. Have you found a pattern there? In other words, is there additional coaching that needs to be done at the board level? Do they need a different composition of the board, or what have you? Could you address that?
Well, right away, if somebody's done it before, they are both psychologically and practically comfortable with the whole model. So you don't have that resistance that can tend to surface 3 or 4 years into it when life's kind of good. And so there's a difference right away that I think does help. The second thing is, if somebody's been through it before, almost always, I forget what the number is, 65, 70% of first acquisition offers do not get executed for all sorts of reasons. And so if you've gone through that, you know a bit better how to even handle it with employees. Do you tell them? Do you engage them in it? How do you manage getting the word out and having your customers get all that stuff that causes these things not to work? Somebody who's been through it, I don't care if they went through it as a founder or they've been through it just as an executive. It's hugely helpful because most of these fail not because of money, but because of people and processes.
Any comment, Bernie or Basil?
Well, integration is a route to failure very often in mergers and acquisitions. I mean, essentially, I read an article a few years back, I don't know if it's still consistent, but more than half of the companies did poorly after they merged into another company because the cultures were so remarkably different. So part of the consideration is, if you've been through this, you can cite that. You actually can see that these cultures match, and this is a marriage made in heaven as opposed to something that will not work out long term. And since you know our stock is symboled, and we can't liquidate for some period in time. During that integration period, that's a very tenuous time where your stock value can fall dramatically.
Another question. Common sense suggests that the more competition you have in an M&A discussion, the higher the price will be. On the other hand, early-stage companies are often very tempted to establish strategic partnerships with larger firms to help them out. You know, where do you come down on how best to manage the competition to raise the price on the ultimate acquisition? Bern.
Well, I've done probably 30 transactions that were collaborations where, in fact, money was put into the companies, but what the acquirer got, because it was an exciting science, was the first right of negotiation. And to the extent that you've done that instead of the first right of refusal, you've left yourself open to talking to multiple companies and can leverage that.
Yeah, in healthcare it's a bit different. Again, partially because of the nature of the players involved and also sort of the limited choices. The sooner you engage with potential partners and that you're working in a variety of ways, they're a distributor, they're an investor, you co-develop some things that allow you to get to know each other. The hit rate on those is so much higher, not just in the exit, but in the actual living on of that entity. You know, we aren't just trying to make money on it. We would like in healthcare to change healthcare. So we have a different motivation. That's why I love the fact that so many family offices are getting involved, because you all, many of you are more patient capital, more mission oriented, willing to work with people. It's a different dynamic than if you've got a widget that just gets plugged into another widget. You can walk away, go start another widget company. They're very different.
It's helpful on a couple of different fronts, if I can plug into that. Because, first of all, you'll know after working with a company that the cultures match and this is someplace you'd like to ultimately be. And there are biotech companies that have worked with 3 and 4 before ultimately exiting. But I think that from an investment point of view, getting that next round of capital, the fact that you're collaborating with a major in your market says that you've got market validation. You know, the average investor can't assess that the market's going to want that. But if a large pharma signs a collaboration with you, then you've got a pretty good clue that the market is going to want that.
You know, in my experience, most of the time, significantly most, maybe 3/4 of the time, when a company has been acquired, the CEO did not know the name of the company that ultimately ended up acquiring them before the transaction started. Didn't even know the name of the company. And the reason that that happens so often is that most of the acquisitions that are done today are horizontal. They're done to get into a business. It's actually much harder to sell a company to a competitor, because then you've got to rationalize product lines and sales teams. It's not as often done as you'd expect. So in our shop, we take kind of a process-oriented approach. We start with a team of researchers who will, in almost every case, come up with more than 100 qualified suspect buyers. And then another team will actually speak to most of those 100 companies. And our goal is to get down to only bothering the management team with a dozen or so, and then narrowing that down to, in an ideal case, 3 simultaneous competitive bidders. And then we run through an auction process, and we get to a point where we really know what the actual market value of that company is. And I believe pretty strongly that if you don't have multiple bids, there's no way that governance was effectively done. Because in this crazy market, even people who live every day in the market cannot tell you exactly how much a company is worth. The only way to know is to have multiple simultaneous bids. Then you know what the value is. Then you can have the optimum outcome and have good governance done.
Thank you. I think we have time for a couple of questions. Nathan?
Yeah, let's open it up to the audience. Again, if you have interest, sign up on your gold sheet, and the exit advisors are happy to connect up. So let's go ahead and open up for a couple quick questions, and then we'll move on to our crypto blockchain panel. Go, Brian.
Go ahead, Brian.
So more on this horizontal acquisition. The idea is that
In the old days, companies toughed it out, did their own R&D, and they came in the markets because they invented something. But now it looks like everybody's buying everything from these startups. Can you talk about that?
It's one of my favorite topics. In my own portfolio, I saw it happen again and again. Small companies beating big companies in the market. Didn't understand it. There's some great research that was done at Harvard. Thomas Wessel wrote 3 really important papers. And what he basically said was that big companies have now got to the point where they know that they're not good at innovation. And they can't be good at innovation because in today's hyper-competitive world, they have to optimize around the one essential competitive advantage, which is the ability to scale. So big companies today need innovation desperately.
so they're good at scale.
They're good at scaling, not at innovation. They acquire innovation, and they're doing it on a portfolio basis. Not that different than the way that we would build an angel portfolio. And I'd be happy to kick that around out in the foyer during the next break if you're interested, because I do see we're out of time now.
Go, Wolfgang.
Basil, you, in your book Exits, one of the outcomes there is that many small exits are better than waiting for this one big exit. Is that still your thesis?
It's not my thesis. It's a reality of the market. Yes, for an angel investor, you're far better off looking for 3 to 5x on a larger percentage of your portfolio. Certainly hang on to the ones that you think are 100 baggers. Try not to sell those. But if you look at where the returns are coming from angels, on average, it is the 3 to 5x returns that are making us most of our money, and that I think we should be focusing most of our time on. But definitely watch out for those unicorns as well.
Yeah, the $30 to $50 million range is the sweet spot really for angel exits.
One more question if we've got it. All right.
So to go through that process to be found by a horizontal purchaser, can companies do this themselves, or do they really need a broker to help them find these potential buyers and get enough interest that there's a bidding war?
I don't want to make this sound like an advertisement for what I have fun doing, but a simple answer is it takes between 1 and 2 man-years of an experienced team. And if you look at what most CEOs and CFOs' days are like, they don't have time to play with their kids. So I've never seen a situation where a CEO and a CFO or any kind of internal team had 1 or 2 man-years of time to spare.
Let me try and address that a different way also, because I no longer am active in my M&A advisory firm. I'm busy running businesses. But that aside, I will tell you something. When you're negotiating directly with a buyer, and you're the key decision maker, the CEO, you have no shade. There's nowhere to go. If you can't push him to the edge of the cliff, because you're going to have to live together afterwards. But a third party can certainly do that and have the CEO pick up the pieces if, in fact, you pushed a little too hard. So there's a real benefit to maximizing the transaction by using a third party. They can push a little harder because he doesn't have to know that company going forward.
All right, well, I think that's all our time. I want to thank the panelists. Excellent job.
Excellent. Thank you, guys.